Hi there, my name's Stephanie Bendixson. I'm an Australian television presenter on a couple of TV shows, namely Screenplay at the moment. It's a video game TV show on YouTube and television, and I'm your host for the business of indie games. So you might see my face a little bit if you haven't seen it already, and thanks for joining in. Today, I'm going to be chatting with Morgan Jaffit. So welcome, Morgan.
Hi there. Good to be here.
So Morgan, you are the co-founder of Defiant Dev and previously a creative director and core team member at Pandemic Studios.
Yes, that's right.
So your creative roots have seen you as a game design lead and also a credited writer on Splinter Cell, which is great. Your consulting days have given you a bit of an insider knowledge and skills on things on the other side of the indie table with senior producing roles for Ubisoft and EA, and you're one of the leading lights and inspirations in the Australian dev scene. So it's wonderful to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. That's very kind.
I guess the first thing I want to ask you is that Defiant has had some incredible growth over the last few years, having built a studio from scratch. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are about 25 people now, give or take. We started as just Dan and I, working in an office in Fortitude Valley after pandemic closed down. So we've kind of managed that growth. We're entirely bootstrapped, entirely self-funded, and we've managed that growth through a combination of factors. But it's always been a matter of balancing kind of the work for hire projects we do and the original IP we build, and the revenue that brings in has allowed us to kind of keep scaling, keep building, and keep bringing on new people, which is great. That was one of the big goals when we set up the studio, was to try and find a home for as much of the great talent that was available in Australia, but that had been kind of left after the GFC and the big studios like Pandemic closed down and left Australia. So it's been really gratifying to be able to build that, and over the 8 years. We've also managed to keep a huge number of the core team together and building together as we go. There's not been a lot of staff turnover. And the nice thing about that, I'm a true believer that great projects come from great teams that get to work on the same kind of broad class of problems over time and get better and better at doing what they do. And I think if you look at the history of kind of blockbuster video game successes that came out of nowhere, almost always they came out of nowhere, but actually they came out of a long period before where people had been doing really good stuff and learning to deal with those issues.
So you mentioned Pandemic, and you mentioned the GFC and the shutdown of a lot of those studios. I remember when that was happening, and for a while, before that, it seemed like we had quite a strong scene, Australian game development scene. And then it seemed like I felt like a lot of studios got bought up by larger studios that ended up shutting them down. I guess, what was your path to kind of rise out of the ashes of that, if you don't mind me putting it that way?
So, no, I think it's a really good observation, because we had a little over 1,500 people, I think, in the Australian games industry overall. And they were all concentrated in US-owned studios. Now, what's happened since then, and we've been a small part of this, is we've grown an industry that's almost as strong as it was then, but it's all Australian-owned studios with their own IP and their own roots here. And of course, when you're owned by an American company, and I've got first-hand experience of this, you're a line on their PowerPoints and their spreadsheets and their presentations. You're not in those meetings every day to defend why your studio is important. And ultimately, you don't own anything. The American company owns all the IP and all the work you've built. So the industry we have now, I think, is a lot more stronger and a lot more robust. I don't think in the glory days of the old studio system, anyone was going, gosh, you know what? There's a clear single point of failure here, and that's a bit of a concern. But it became clear when the GFC happened, and everybody had to account for that. I mean, the Aussie dollar shot up at that point as well, which made Australian studios not look as cheap as they once had. And a lot of the Australian studios had built a reputation for being cost-effective, Western-focused, and good at delivering on time. And the market at the top end had moved, in the AAA space, had moved to very much a blockbusters or bankrupt kind of model. we didn't have a local blockbuster background. We hadn't set our bar as what we're going to do is deliver games that are really high quality at all costs. So during that shakeout, I mean, studios with reputations for building things like Call of Duty or I was going to say BioShock, but then that ties into the Australian 2K that eventually got closed, sadly. But yeah, overall that wasn't the reputation Australia had. I think what we've built now is a really strong reputation for building world-class indie games. So they're smaller, but we don't let that stand in the way of making things that can stand head and shoulders with everything else. And that's made a real difference in the health of the industry.
Using work for hire to supplement or and fund original development can be a great studio strategy. How does your studio manage this and manage to avoid the kind of pitfalls that are involved with that as well?
That's how we built the studio, really. And it's interesting because, of course, I mean, I talk to a lot of young indie studios, and the number one question that people always ask is, how do we get funded, right? We've got this great game idea, we've got a great team. Where's the money come from? And that's a hard question to answer at the best of times. Sometimes you've got an idea or a prototype or a proof of concept so good that you can get publisher money behind it. Sometimes you have to take that idea to market yourself in order to convince people to get on board. But if you're going to do that, you've got to pay for yourself, right? And we have always had a model at Defiant where everybody gets paid and everybody gets paid market rate. Nobody's in for sweat equity, except myself and Dan, who as co-founders, you have to pull along. But it's important to us that staff are treated properly and that we look after them at every point along the way. So that leaves your options kind of limited. And for us, what we found is that what we might have originally thought, which is that we would do contracting work for games companies and that would be where our work for hire stuff would come in, actually turned out to largely not be the case. So what we did is we built some really interesting proofs of concept in the augmented reality space. This was about 8 years ago. We worked closely with Qualcomm to help build those, as they were the ones who had kind of an augmented reality library for mobile at the time. And that resulted in them getting in touch with us and saying, hey, people have asked us if anybody would put together an augmented reality thing for them. Is that the sort of thing you might be interested in doing? And from there, we started doing work for hire in that space. That led to us talking to a lot of the local digital agencies and ad agencies, letting them know that if they wanted a game as a promotional thing, that was a thing we could do. And those were the sorts of projects we put together. And I think there's something really valuable to taking your game skills and working out how to apply them to a parallel but not directly games business. And one of the big ones is that means you bring extra value to the equation. And if you bring extra value to the equation, if you can say, I always look at it as most work for hire jobs, you're solving somebody else's problem. So if you can find a problem that's out there where you're better able to solve it than Joe random off the street because of your specialized knowledge, that puts you in a really good place. So we knew how to make games. There were ad agencies and augmented reality companies, and they all wanted games, and they might try and build them in-house. But if they could just sign a check and it would get done and it'd be good and it'd be built by somebody who knew how to make games, that would be way better. And that's kind of where we slotted in for a couple of years, was doing those projects for those sorts of companies, saving the money we made and using that to pay our staff and build mobile games and our own experiments. And it's from that process that games like Heroes Call came, and that we're able to keep the team together, because I think that's kind of, from an indie business perspective, that's job number one, right? You've got to keep together, you've got to keep them paid, you've got to keep them working on the interesting problems so that you can keep moving forward to the point where your revenue streams can provide and sustain for that group.
Once you do have a game up and running, how do you manage the development pipeline? I suppose, what processes and tools do you use to make sure that a game goes from concept to fruition in kind of, and released on time and in budget?
It varies a ton. And I will be 100% honest that on time, on budget, for us applies a lot more to external projects than it does to our internal projects. Our own stuff tends to be as good as it can be, but late. And honestly, that's because of where you put the values, right? If you're doing work for hire, you have generally you've got a fixed price contract. That fixed price contract is based on your monthly rate, and it's got some margin built in. But if you're being paid, let's say, $7,000 per person on your team per month, and that's the outlay, and they've decided to pay you for 6 months. That's what they've budgeted, and that's what they've got to hand. If you can do the job in that time, great. If you can't do the job in that time, then things start getting a bit antsy. So you want to make sure that you're shipping to time and to budget. And there's the day-to-day of managing production on small projects. These are generally 4, 5, 6 person projects. I'm not going to say straightforward because that makes it sound like it's straightforward, but it's pretty easily capturable by process, right? What you're trying to do is make sure that every day, every person's doing the most important thing and hitting the milestones that are approved. And the real key to making sure that you don't slip your dates or miss the expectations is that no milestone is ever missed on the day that you fail to turn it in. Those milestones were missed 3 months earlier. And because of that, what you want to be doing is looking at the end of your project. Okay, so the project has to ship in December. We know that as a 6-month duration project, we have to spend at least a month on polish. So that means that, in November, the game has to be finished. And we also know that the difference between finished and everything's in there is another month, right? So you're working your way back, and now you're in October saying, okay, well, actually, everything in the game is done by October. And that's only 4 months after you started. So now you're getting into pretty quick timelines, right? You actually only have 4, if you're doing 4 weekly milestones, you've only got 4 milestones to put in everything that you're going to do. So you want to work fast, and you want to start roughing in the things that are important really quickly. We make sure that we're talking to the stakeholders at every milestone, setting the expectations that they would have, and also making it really clear that at that first gate, you're like, look, let me show you. First milestone's always great. Like, everybody loves first milestone because the delivery date is so far in the future that it'll be this thing that you showed that's really cool, plus everything that I can dream of, right? So nobody's ever failed their first milestone. I'm sure some people have, but you shouldn't fail your first milestone. If you set up expectations really badly if you fail your first milestone. Things start to get into the nitty-gritty on the second and third milestone, where you're talking to these people and saying, look, these are the things we've done. These are the things that are cool. This is what's achievable. And these are the things we're not doing. And these are the things that aren't in scope. I'm a huge believer in clear no's. It's really, I think often when you're a small indie, and you're doing work for hire projects, you're simultaneously the salesperson and the producer. I wear both those hats, and I think that's pretty true for most people. That means if you're in a salesman mode, it can be incredibly tempting to say yes to everything that comes through. Whatever gets the deal done, right? Like, you want it in pink, that's fine. You want it to work on 900 different platforms, that's fine. You've got an NVIDIA. You've got an N-Gage at home, we'll make it work on that. Whatever it is that you need, we can do. And the truth of the matter is that no is actually the best tool of a producer. And you can dig into the expectations. You can actually say, look, why do you want that? What's that going to deliver? Here are the pros and cons. If that goes in, something's going out. And that's how the discussion has to go through milestone 2 and 3. And then milestone 4 is really important, because milestone 4 is if it's not in here, it's not going in. And that whole conversation really needs to be happening around milestone 3 there. You need to be saying, these are the last things on our list. You should expect to see them in milestone 4. After that, we'll be working on polish. And after that, we'll be working on bringing everything together, making sure the launch goes smoothly, making sure that everything we've delivered is delivered to the highest possible value. And that expectation management side is how all that external production works. The internal production side is about focusing for each of those milestones on what you're going to deliver, what that's going to look like, why those things are important, making sure that what they're for is outlined really well, and making sure that you're delivering. The team has all the information necessary to deliver what the client wants and is going to make them happy.
So with the work for hire development stuff that you do you aim to make a profit with that, or do you see the royalties as being the profit? I mean, what are your margins like with that kind of
always aim to make a profit on that, because it all comes down to opportunity cost, right? So the opportunity cost is you're not spending this time working on your own stuff. So it has to be buying you more time to work on your own stuff down the line. And if it's not doing its job very well. So in terms of what our margins are there, our margins ranged depending on where our kind of per person costs were, but ideally you want to make them 50%, right? So you want to make them so that your 6 months of working for somebody else buys you 6 months of working for yourself. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb to have in place. There's ways you can improve that. You can get your own costs right down, particularly if you're a group of people working in a kind of sweat equity style situation where you can pay yourself, a minimal wage to get by. And sometimes they'll creep up over that. But before your burn rate is really oppressive, it's a good idea to get to make sure that you're not taking jobs just to have jobs, right? You're not taking jobs just to keep the mouths on the team fed. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they're quite young and they start doing development. They're like, hey, we don't cost much. We have very, very low, very cheap lifestyles. We will bid for these jobs and take these jobs, and that will keep us going. And because we can keep going, we can do stuff. There comes a point where you have to take those jobs because you have mouths to feed every month, but you're always dealing with people who don't value the work you do. It's my general experience that it's about as hard to sign a contract for $10,000 as it is to sign a contract for $50,000.
Right.
The same amount of work. And the people who want to pay you $2,000, it's their own personal money. So it's a lot of money. So they really make you work for it. And in none of this, I'm not suggesting you should ever be not delivering value for money. You should. That's absolutely the goal. But you've also got to be developing value for your studio so that you're not just spinning your wheels.
So it seems like you're very focused now on business development and production management, despite the fact that you're very creative. How do you channel that creativity to ensure that you're organized to kind of thrive commercially, I suppose, across the board?
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of support on the business side. We have an excellent producer and an excellent studio manager in the studio. Dan Treble, who's my co-founder, is the tech director here and also handles some of the day-to-day production oversight and a lot of the business oversight. Sean Eustace is our art director and also does a phenomenal job. So we have a great team, and that frees me up to be more involved in the creative side of our games and our content. But the honest truth of the matter is, like, the way I describe my job, depending on what sort of challenges we're dealing with at the time, is one of two things, right? My job is to look to the road ahead and make sure that everybody has a clear path so that every day they can come in and do their job without worrying about the things that lie ahead. So I'm a snowplow ahead of the team, and that's to make clear track. And that's quite, in essence, that's about charting the ultimate destiny of the studio along with the rest of the team leadership. So I do see that as a creative and fulfilling side of things. The other way to look at this when you're doing client work is that is that it's raining a lot of shit, and my job is to be the umbrella. So you can kind of take either metaphor depending on what day of the week it is. But I also work with the design team here and the writing team to make sure that they have every opportunity to do the best possible work, to try and provide frameworks for them to work in, so that our work is consistent and holistic, and so that everybody else knows what to do. And as production goes on, my job has more of a tiebreaker element to it, in that if there are creative calls, generally speaking, I think the best person to make any creative decision is the person closest to the mechanics of that decision, so the person working on that system. My job's to provide the high-level kind of goals that help them make those decisions. But there are times when people are like, look, I want to do this, the other person wants to do this. We can argue about it all day, but we need a decision, and that's when I can make a decision and we can move on.
And so how have your experiences working for larger developers and I suppose attending all those pitch meetings and things helped you with handling the sort of business side of what you're doing now?
I was really, really lucky in my professional experience. I worked at Behaviour Interactive in Montreal, and they were a kind of work for hire studio who did a lot of licensed games of movies, those sorts of things. And when I was there, I got to pitch a lot because I was a pretty good writer, and it was a French-Canadian company, so I was one of the native English writers. I could write pitches fast, and that got me into the room for a lot of the pitches. And while I wasn't dealing with all the business side of things, I got to see a lot of that from the periphery. And the first time you pitch to big publishers is scary. Once you've done it 10 or 11 times, you start to get a sense for how it goes. So that was a great hothouse environment for pitching skills. And then when Pandemic Australia was closed, we tried to spin off the team in the studio, and EA gave us a chance to do that. And Josh Resnick, who was the president of Pandemic, personally helped us there and took us on a pitching tour, took us around to meet all his contacts. He now co-runs Sugarfina, which is a candy shop that's on the, it's one of Oprah's favourite things, and it's on the top 50 list. And Josh is an absolutely fantastic business person, and he really, by opening all of those doors and by helping us attend all those meetings and by taking us through that process, again, I got to watch a lot of that happen up close, and there was an incredible experience and really useful. So both of those kind of really rapid fire experiences helped set up the relationships and the business that helped us start Defiant. And then after that, I just made sure that, because we're in Australia, we're a long way away from the business of games. So, we were making sure that we were at every GDC, heading to Gamescom in Cologne, heading to PAX, and just doing meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And those meetings are about, they weren't about deals, they were about relationships. Every time we've done a deal, it's been with somebody we've known for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. And I think that's the truth of a lot of pitching. People will look at the pitch on its merits, but they also want to look at the studio. And if you come out of nowhere and you're like, here's a great pitch for a great game, they're like, sure, but can you make it? But if you show up every year and you're like, you know what? We're not here to do a deal this year. I just thought I'd update you on what we're up to. This is what we're doing now. And next year, this is where we'll be. And if you keep coming back time after time and doing what you said you'd do, then you build trust and you build the understanding that you can deliver on the things you say you can deliver. And then that opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities.
You've said before that when you're pitching to a publisher, something that's really helpful is to ask the right questions. For example, if this project goes really well, what does that look like to you? What are some of the kinds of questions that you should be asking a publisher?
Anytime we're in a deal with somebody, we see that as a partnership. And, a good partnership is about knowing what your partner needs and helping them achieve it. And I'm 100% not a believer in exploitative contracts. We've seen a lot of them from various people in the industry. We've seen a lot of them in terms of the way some companies in the industry treat their staff. None of that at any point. There's a business mentality that is less common, I think, in Australia, but persists in parts of the United States, where your value is how much value you can extract out of somebody else. So that every deal has a winner and a loser, and if you win the most, then that's a good deal. And we just don't do those deals. So we don't, and we never have, and we've never seen the value in it. So you can't deliver value for your partner if you don't know what value is for them. And sometimes it's just that they're like, make a game that makes a lot of money. And that's easy, right? but at least straightforward, and everybody understands what the metrics for success are. But in big companies, it's really often that's not the metric for success. The metric for success might be, I want this to generate a lot of news. You know, I want this to establish how our company is a leader in this field. I want this to open the doors for new business. I want this to show that we can do things that nobody else can do. And if you know those are the things they want to achieve, and sometimes the person you're talking to is like, I just want to impress my boss, and then you know that you're not talking to the right person, right? You're like, cool, I need to talk to your boss and know what would impress them. You can only bring value to a relationship, and you can only know that relationship will bring value to you in any part of your life if you know what people want. And the only way to know what people want is to ask and to listen.
Another thing that you've spoken about previously that I think is fantastic is the idea of mocking up a Kickstarter campaign, whether you're going to use Kickstarter or not. Yeah. Can you talk about why that might be valuable?
Yeah, and I mean, that was an observation of its time. I don't know whether that's the course I'd recommend now. Maybe you mock up a Steam page and use Facebook ads and see if you could get people there. But in any case, the premise is the same, right? Which is, would people be impassioned enough about your game to put their hard-earned money in? The earlier you can ask that question in development, the better you're poised to know whether your game has appeal. And there's there's so much theory about marketing and what you should do with the game and what the right approaches are and how all those things work. And every bit of that theory is thrown out the window if you make a game that's absolutely amazing. So people will make people would tell you not to make Dream Daddy 1,000,000 times if you asked. But if your execution is great and you can capture the hearts of people who haven't been given something that addresses their needs, you will do well every time. And none of that you can get from theory or marketing. But I do think you can start to mock that up early on and gauge interest and see what people do. And then there are games where just the execution is so good that it makes up for a bad name, or not to slag anybody off, but Into the Breach came out a couple of days ago and is doing gangbusters. And I would argue that is not a great name for a game. I think it's a pretty average name that doesn't actually grab hearts and minds. But the game does. The game's amazing. The game does enough. So any rule you can come up with on this kind of front, you will always find a counterpoint to.
Sure.
But I think thinking about your marketing early is the mistake most indies make. So the most common mistake is to get to the end, say, nobody bought my game, I need some marketing. And then it is too late.
Yeah.
Because marketing is about, why do people want to talk about your game? What about your game is exciting to them? Why should they tell a friend? Why, when they hear about it, do they go, oh, I want that? Why do they tell other people, did you hear there's a game about dating daddies? And somebody else goes, no, that sounds great. I want that. That's what you need. Every game needs to be able to be communicated in that fashion. And if you put up a mock Kickstarter for your game and it generates no money, it means it's not exciting people. And boy, it's great to find that out at the start, not the end. because there's nothing worse than getting a game to market and finding that it's just not interesting, that people don't care. So that's something we try and do as often and as early as possible. And we do it by showing our ideas to close allies and friends and other indie devs, engaging their excitement. There are people I know will tell us our idea's shitty. If it's shitty, there's people I know who will say, I'm just not getting what's special about that if you show us something. And they always do it in the nicest possible way, which is to say, oh, I'm sure you could do something great with that, but I'm not seeing it right now. If you do that at the start, not the end, you save an enormous amount of time and money.
So we've talked a little bit about the development timeline and milestones as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the delicacy in handling the need to move a milestone and whether you've agreed to be paid for hitting a milestone at a certain date and that kind of thing?
This is always the hardest conversation, right? And it does come back to what I was saying earlier, which is that a missed milestone should never be a surprise that arrives on the date the milestone doesn't.
Right.
So if you've somehow got yourself in a position where you're working with an external party and the milestone date has come due and you don't say anything, and then a couple more days pass and you don't say anything, and eventually you get an email a week later to say, hey, weren't you supposed to send us a milestone? And that's when you're like, oh yeah, all the shit's messed up. I can't help you. We'll get it sometime. Then you are well and truly in trouble. But if you've kind of prepped the ground for that and explained what you're trying to do and why that hasn't worked, I mean, all game development is software development, and all software development, unless we're knocking off something that's already been done, has an element of risk and has an element of research and has an element of learning involved in it. So it can all go wrong. Ideally, it goes wrong in small pieces, and you've managed to segment things out and build things in such a way that the piece that's gone wrong isn't dragging the whole thing down. You can easily be in a position where you're sitting there and going, look, we said we would deliver these things for this milestone. We've done 3 of the 4, and the 4th just didn't work. You know, we tried it this way, we tried it that way, and it hasn't worked. And as you say, there's a couple of options when that happens in a work for hire scenario. You can say, look, obviously it's going to take a little longer, but you know, there's another month of development in this, and we'll cover the costs of that out of our margin, and we'll make things good. And we've certainly done that. We've done that when we feel like we've missed the boat. But the other way, which I think is, to be honest, is equally common and is mostly a matter of communication, is that, you know, we're late because what you expect is better than we have time to do. And if that's the case, and if you've prepped them at each point along the way, and if you've clearly communicated how you're going, both in the middle of milestones and at key milestones, if you're late through ultimately no fault of your own, but through broader ambition of the project, then it's very easy to have that conversation. And that conversation should always be in the case of, look, we can still aim to ship for the initial date. As I was saying earlier in the piece, I really think you should be having a conversation about moving your ship date by 2 months. No less than 2 months before you ship, right? Because 2 months before you ship, your game should be done and you should be into the polish phase. And if it's not, you know that you're coming in hot. And that's when you can have a conversation about, look, we think it'd be better if you put this a couple of months out and we did more. And I mean, there's absolutely scenarios too. You can look at these kind of 3 scenarios. There's one where it's undoubtedly your fault. You've messed up. You haven't done what you agreed to do. And in that case, you better be able to pay the difference. And hopefully the date wasn't too important. There's another scenario over here where they've asked for something unreasonable, or they haven't provided you with the resources you need at the times that you had them laid out. or they don't really care much about the date, but they definitely want to get all the things in that they've asked for along the way. They've changed their requirements, where it's undoubtedly your client's fault and they should pay. Most stuff sits in the middle somewhere, and the stuff that sits in the middle is a matter of negotiation. But those negotiations are always helped if you've been communicating clearly at every point along the way what the expectations are. And these are scary conversations to have. You know, conversations about money are always scary. Conversations about money that come with a bunch of guilt attached are even scarier to have. So it's easy emotionally to avoid them, and you're always better pulling off the bandage earlier. You should always be making sure you're communicating clearly with your clients at every stage along the game. If there's fear on the horizon, it's better to let them know now, so that when it arrives, all the fear has been taken out.
So having had quite a broad range of experiences, do you prefer working with publishers or publishing yourself? And I suppose, what are the pros and cons of each?
I'm trying to give a tactful answer, especially given we're about to take a pitch out to publishers right now. So I must see some value in publishers, right? And there is value, and I think there's especially value for small indies. So we're about 25 people now. We self-publish Hand of Fate. We've built up the infrastructure to handle a lot of those publishing requirements. And some of those publishing requirements that we don't handle, we just pay for. So we work with a PR firm who does very good work for us. They charge us. We pay an amount for our PR, but it's just a cost, right? And I think most publishers are in the business of, if your game is a big success, the things they provide can actually be broken out and itemised and costed, and they charge quite a lot for them. But if your game is not, then they've given you those for effectively free. So a publisher on board is good to mitigate the risk. They're also very good if you don't have the upfront cash to pay for those sorts of services. If you're in a position where you can fund your own development, and you can fund QA, and you can fund PR, and you can fund some marketing, then you're in a good position to not work with a publisher. But a publisher can help you. I mean, it also depends what your market is, right? So if you're working on the Steam market at the moment, I would argue that there are very few publishers who've shown that they can make a game a hit on Steam that wouldn't otherwise have been a hit, right? And a lot of Steam hits are indies who did no PR and no QA, and have just made something people really want to play that hits the spot. But the flip side of all of this is that a publisher can bring leverage to the table. They're a bigger organisation. If you're a 3-person indie and you want to think about shipping the game, you don't want to think about your QA passes and how you're going to do your marketing plan and all of those sort of things. It takes a lot of that strain off you. Now, my personal philosophy is that you should learn those skills because you will look after your own house better than anybody else ever can. So I think it's good for an indie developer to become an end-to-end developer if, and it's a big if they want to build a business in the indie space. Because you can absolutely make games. I mean, the whole point of the conference here is about the business of indie games, but you don't have to build a business around your indie game just because you want to make an indie game. But if you want it to provide your living and your livelihood and the livelihood of others, then I think it behooves you to learn the entire process end to end, and you'll be a better studio if you handle it end to end. But yeah, publishers can take that load off, particularly when you're a smaller team, and publishers can magnify your efforts if you're a larger team and provide resources and funding that can make things possible that would otherwise be impossible.
Now, I feel like something that that people are thinking about when they're trying to make a game that people will want to play is they look at other games that have been successful and try to sort of copy the same trends. I feel like Battle Royale is something that's going to be in every game coming forward. I think it's in every pitch that's going around at the moment. Right. Yeah. Something you've said is that you need to not necessarily pay attention to where the market has been, but where it's going. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, and it's exactly to avoid. I mean, games take 2 years to make if you're lucky. You can move faster. I mean, if you Matt Hall, games take 8 weeks to make, and then you make Crossy Road and it makes $50 million and everything's great. Very few of us are Matt Hall. Even Matt Hall isn't Matt Hall every day. So, you know, in general, we're making games that take 2 years to make, and that means we have to look 2 years out into the market to try and look at what we think will be happening then. And we do a lot of projection. I think every piece of understanding about the future that we have is simply by watching what's happening today. But we always extrapolate our lines out, right? So if you're looking at a game and you're going, okay, cool, I see that Battle Royales are doing huge. On the day that PUBG came out, if you can do a fast follow, it's not the craziest idea, right? I've never seen as fast a follow as Fortnite.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable and speaks to how well Epic understand their engine and how canny they are. But generally speaking, if you can do a fast follow into a hot market, that's actually not a terrible thing to do. But if you're looking at, like, we're starting a game, we've got 2 years to go, what's going to be happening in 2 years? You only have to watch 3 months of, like, Battle Royale announcements to realize that there will be a ton of Battle Royale games. And that, like most multiplayer games, there will be very, very striking winners, and everybody else will be a loser in that space. So unless you have a really, really unique spin that you think is going to pull people away from Fortnite, that's a very tough market to go into. There is no tougher market than multiplayer shooter. And that said, you got to look at the size of your team, the size of your budget, how much you're going to spend, what games make that amount of money, what games look like they'll make that amount of money in the future, what your hook is both mechanically but also from a marketing perspective, who might want that, where you're going to sell it, who buys games on Steam. I mean, I look at a lot of the quirkier indie games, and I think, so a good example of where people were looking versus where they are today. Before the floodgates opened on Steam and they started letting people in through the greenlight process, Steam was hand-picking which titles went on. And Steam hand-picked on the basis of sometimes relationships, but primarily on the basis of games they thought were good games. So they were looking for things that were at Indiecade and games that won awards, and that was the sort of thing that you got on the front page of Steam. And that was the sort of thing that got let in, and everybody else had a hard time getting onto Steam. Even once Greenlight opened, people's games got greenlit, but then it took them 12 months or so to get through that process. So the first Hand of Fate came out in 2015, and even though the greenlight process had let through about 1,000 games at that point in time, very few of those had been released. We were still dealing with a relatively open market. But what people looked at was those games that game insiders, people inside the games industry like, which is what Steam was curating in 2013, 2014, 2015. They looked at games like that were successes, so the sorts of games that people who know games talk about. And they went, those games are really commercial because, gosh knows, Gone Home made a ton of cash. There are many, many games across the board that did well in that market and in that curated industry. Now that Steam's an open market, those games have a really hard time. Tacoma, as a spiritual successor, did really poorly. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture didn't do great. I mean, these are good games and good examples of what they are, but they represent a market that is the market insiders think about, not the market people want. So, but in terms of the market people want, I mean, Dream Daddy is right in that mix, right? You can still make really interesting stuff. It's just the interesting stuff you make has to be, if you're making it for Steam, has to be tuned towards the Steam audience because you've got to survive. It's a very survival of the fittest, algorithmically driven market right now. The Apple market's a bit different because it's hand curated, right? So something like Florence, which is a beautiful Australian game that everybody should check out, has shot right up to the top of the charts because it's had really strong editorial featuring, because Apple do hand curate their front page. So, and it's a paid game, and that means that people are looking at that on the front page, looking at what it presents, looking at what that game is and what it's about, and deciding it's worth their hard-earned money, which is really, really great. So, yeah, you have to understand the market you're going into, the market forces that operate there, and what they're doing today, and what they were doing yesterday, and what they were doing a year ago, and kind of draw a trend line between those and try to extrapolate to where the future is.
And talking about the broader gaming market, I mean, in addition to making mass mobile games, you've kind of been able to identify smaller niche markets and design new games that'll appeal to maybe like a couple of 100,000 players, but paying at about sort of $20 a unit. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, that's what brought us over from being mobile developers, because we made a game that was a really hardcore, that had really hardcore gameplay, but a really cutesy look, which was a game called Rocket Bunnies way back when. And from that, we then made Ski Safari with Brendan and Sean, and we made Heroes Call internally. And Heroes Call was about pursuing that kind of hardcore Diablo-esque side. And what we realized is two things, right? One, we didn't really know how to make a free-to-play game because that was early in free-to-play, and we had a lot to learn. But two, that our market for that kind of fantasy Diablo-esque kind of stuff wasn't on mobile to the same extent that it was on Steam. It had a really good crossover with the Steam audience. So then we started thinking about how we would build something that fit into that slot. But because of where we come from, Hand of Fate ended up being this crossover between a board game and kind of fantasy dungeon crawler, which starts moving you into a smaller niche. And the great thing about a small niche, and this is something that the Armello team can talk about really well as well, with they've got a board game that's anthropomorphic animals. There are people in that niche who've never been given something that's just for them. And if you give them something that's just for them, that hasn't been watered down, but that actually deals really, explicitly with the crossover of these Venn diagrams, then they will love what you've made, and they will be really great advocates for it. And that can help you break a little beyond that niche. But I think it's really good this is where we're looking at how much games sell and looking at projections and understanding kind of broadly what a game can make in the market helps. We knew we weren't making blockbusters. We didn't have to make blockbuster style money. We didn't have to beat Call of Duty at market. We didn't even have to beat FTL at market. We could, but if we could sit into that middle zone, then we could be very happy. We would have paid development costs. We would have looked after our team, and we could afford to make whatever our next game was. So the investment was really worthwhile there.
No, no one has a crystal ball. When you talk about market analysis, what tools do you use to analyze the market? How can you predict what you think will be successful?
So nobody has a crystal ball, and predicting and what the market loves is something it's never seen before.
Sure.
Predicting how things that we've never seen before do is really as hard as hell. But the thing I say is that you need to hone your intuitions, because most of us have a gut check about what we would like or we would buy. And we are generally super informed about the games world. We're a very high information customer. We're not the norm. So working through what would I do here is generally not the best approach. You actually want to be lined up around what is the market doing. And that's the bit that you can follow, right? So to work out what the market's doing in the future, you look at what the market's doing today. And when we were making mobile games, I would look at App Annie at the start of every week, and I would look at every game that was on the top charts. and every game that was coming out, and we would make predictions and projections, Dan, my business partner, and I, and we would say, I think this one will do well because X, Y, Z. I think this one won't because, you know, of these other factors. And mostly you're right, and then sometimes you're wrong. And when you're wrong, you're like, oh, why was I wrong about that? Okay, well, and the good thing is because Ski Safari had done pretty well, we knew roughly what the return on investment for different chart positions was. So we could watch a game that got to the number 2 position in the grossing charts and be like, well, that's made a lot of money that day. Look at other games that had got to the number 2 position on the top paid games chart and see that it was also in the number 1,000 position on the top grossing chart and be like, oh, well, that wasn't a lot of money that it made in that position. So you start to nut out these details as you look at it day in, day out. Now that we're on Steam, we do the same with Steam. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because if you ever go to a dinner that Valve hold, where there's a bunch of developers there, in the days before Steam Spy, and you have a game that's been on the charts, every single person in that room knows about that game. They look at the charts and they will say to you, you know, oh, I saw your game came out. It got up to number 3, didn't it? And hung about there for a week or two. Good show. And that's because that's what everybody who's running a studio and paying attention should be doing, right? Like, that's what the people who are doing successfully are doing. They're watching the market so that we can help to understand where the market might go or what the future trends are. So none of us have a crystal ball for the future, but the better we understand the forces acting today, the better we're placed to see what it is down the track. And now you've got access to Steam Spy, and that's unbelievably useful, but also really, really gives you an opportunity to get the wrong end of the stick. So if you aren't doing things like tracking free weekends and discounts and pricing, then it's a very, very rough estimate of how a game's done. But if you want to know, like, if you want to look at something and say, hey, I was thinking of making a game like this, how's it done? You can get a sense of kind of what order of magnitude it is. You know, has it sold 1,000 copies at $2? Has it sold hundreds of thousands of copies at somewhere between $10 and $20? You know, you can rough these out, and you don't have to rough them out as much if you're paying attention to titles during their launch week. You can get a good sense of where their launch week is and how that goes on. So yeah, pay as much attention as you can. That's your job. If you're running a indie business as opposed to an indie hobby.
Are there any particular models that you've seen emerging recently?
I think that what's really, there are 2 things that are really pulling people incredibly strongly at the moment. One of those is, and talking primarily about Steam, because that's where I've been looking a lot at the moment. One is a lot of price consciousness around time investment. So there are games that are chewing up huge amounts of people's time. So multiplayer games, like people spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in PUBG. But for games to be really successful, they need to have content that's worth exploring in an ongoing fashion. I think shorter games are getting hit pretty hard. Firewatch did great, and that's at least partially because Firewatch is amazingly good. And as I say, stuff that's amazingly good will always break your heuristics. And palette cleanser games are a real thing. People do want to jump into a palette cleanser game. If they've got a game they spend hundreds of hours in, that's their hobby. And the other stuff around the edges is kind of stuff they'll dive into and spend a bit of time with, but it's not the core. So there is a market for those games, but yeah, I think more and more you've got to look at games that people can spend real time in. So 50 plus hours in to be making a value proposition that you belong in the $20 to $30 bracket.
Now, you tried to get in early on sort of the Google and Apple app stores, and I suppose there's a reasonable guess at market direction and opportunity there. And were those costly experiments for you?
So, I mean, they weren't because we salvaged everything, but that's how Hand of Fate started, right? Is we looked around, and this is before the PS4 and the Xbox One came out, and we made a prediction that the PS4 and the Xbox One weren't going to sell great because that's what the vibe was. It was wrong, but that was what the vibe was. And that things with controllers were going to be the new thing. So the Ukie had just had a really successful Kickstarter, and you're like, these Android mini devices with controllers. We heard rumors that Apple was going to bring out an Apple TV with a controller attached. And we're like, cool, so we'll make games that will fit on those. And that's how Hand of Fate started. Unfortunately, Hand of Fate's development cycle was long enough that we actually got to see how the Ukie did. And we realized pretty quickly that was a bad place to go.
What?
Exactly. And that's what we did, right? We're like, cool, you know what? Xbox and PS4 have sold a lot better. Steam is opening up Greenlight. Let's, do the work to make this feel like it's a valuable thing on those platforms and get the hell out of Dodge. But we're lucky that we're a Unity studio, right? Because changing platforms was a easier consideration than it would have been if we'd built our tech from scratch. If we'd built our tech from scratch to run on Ukie, we would be very sad. But yeah, that's an experiment where most of the things we built got rolled into the future. Unfortunately, because we were targeting controllers, that ended up being a thing that was still valid in the future that happened, as opposed to the future we guessed at. We've definitely started games. I mean, it's more expensive to start a game, get some way down the line and can it, which we've done a few times. And we always do it because, I mean, it's a really scientific principle that leads to us cancelling games. And it's just because the vibe ain't there, right? Like when it gets down to it, that's you get some period down the line on that project and you're like, you know what? We're just not feeling it. But the excitement and the passion that drives people to come in and come up with new ideas and work out how they spin into it, it's just not there. And therefore, we're probably on the wrong track.
It's hard because I suppose you learn from each one of these experiences, but through that experience, and I suppose any other that you've had, throughout your time in game development, is there anything that you wish you could have done quite differently?
I'm always thinking about what I'll do in the future more than relitigating the past. I mean, I'm very happy with where we've got to. And a lot of that is good timing and luck, and a great team and decisions that were very much not my own. So there's not a ton I would change. I would have gone indie earlier, with the wealth of information available to me now. I would have gone indie earlier, but I've been part of studios that have closed, and the thing you learn there is that like companies are just artificial constructs, right? People is what persists, and the people go on even when the companies go down. So I've been part of companies that have folded. I wasn't in a position where I could have made where what I did was what was going to make the difference in whether those stayed open or not. So I don't relitigate the past, and touch wood, we're doing okay. So I'm happy with where that is. So there's not a ton I would change. I'm pretty happy with where we've ended up and the decisions we've made.
I guess my final question for you then would be if you just had a few pieces of advice that you would give to anyone who's looking to, start their indie dev experience and get published and go on their journey, what would that be?
The first thing, and I think this is a really fundamental one, is that you need to stand by your work. That's what that's what's going to be your calling card. Don't let it go out the door if it's not up to your standards, and do what's necessary to make it deliver. The second one, and this is a really important one, right? And it speaks to kind of the things that I was talking about right at the start, which is know what you stand for. Like, know why you exist. Why are you doing this and not doing something else? What is it that you do that nobody else can do? What do you bring to the table that nobody else is doing? And make sure that's what you're doing each day. Don't get yourself trapped where you have to say yes to every opportunity that comes by because somebody offered you the opportunity. Go and seek the opportunities that are meaningful for you. If you're doing work for hire projects and you're doing it to gather the resources, know what those resources are for. Know what you're bringing to the table that will enable you to do the things that are important. And I think it's so easy to get stuck in the day-to-day of the opportunities we have in front of us and the track that's laid down for us. And being indie actually means that, every indie dev gets the honorary hatchet when they join. You can cut your own way through and cut your own way through to somewhere that's worth going, and make sure you go there with as much passion and enthusiasm as you can.
Well, thank you so much, Morgan. It was incredible to talk to you today, and that's going to be such a valuable experience for so many people who are looking to, I suppose, follow in your footsteps in many ways.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Where can people find you on social media if they want to get in touch with more questions?
So I am Morgan Jaffit. That's MorganJaffit. And that is me on Twitter. That is me at Gmail. That is me probably everywhere. There are no other Morgan Jaffits. So whatever stupid thing I said, that was me. And that's where you'll find me.
Great. So there's going to be a bit of a Q&A on Twitter as well. So all you need to do is include Morgan's Twitter handle and the hashtag TBoIG Summit. And there's, of course, our Business of Indie Games Facebook group as well. That's
fabulous.
Got lots of great conversation there as well. So thank you so much for your time, Morgan. That was awesome.
Great. Thank you.